Welcome to More Context, the channel where I add context to stories in the news. Today I look at the recent protests in Israel and try to find a path to a ceasefire. Earlier this month, we had large protests and strikes break out in Israel, focusing on Netanyahu after 6 hostages were killed by Hamas, which seemed somewhat surprising here in the US. Why were they blaming Netanyahu and not Hamas? I mean, IDF forces have already directly killed hostages on multiple occasions. Israel assassinated Hamas's lead negotiator after he agreed to a ceasefire, and 40,000 Palestinians are dead. But now suddenly we have giant protests blaming Netanyahu? We also got to see Israel using tactics designed for Palestinians on their own people. Tactics meant to make peaceful protests impossible. What I found interesting, though, was how American media struggled to explain what was going on. I had to go to Israeli news outlets to find out why they were blaming Netanyahu for Hamas killing the hostages instead of blaming Hamas. Eventually, we got articles like this out of CNN, explaining how they basically failed to cover the key piece of news, which is that Hamas has agreed to ceasefires to various degrees multiple times from May to June. And Netanyahu just keeps adding conditions while straight out saying there can't be peace until Hamas is destroyed. Now, I should be fair, they did cover the May agreement, but that was the one where they said Egypt had changed the terms of the deal before showing them to Hamas. So then they had slightly differing agreements, and rather than working out the differences, Israel just decided to push on to Rafah. And to be doubly fair, the CNN article does actually link to an article they had that covered the June negotiations as well. You see, at the bottom of an article about Netanyahu's visit to D.C., they'll find a quote saying, "It's up to Netanyahu now," immediately followed by an Israeli official disagreeing. So I guess that's one way to inform people that Hamas agreed to a deal. Talk about burying the lead. So the thing that changed, that caused all these protests, is more info about how Netanyahu had derailed negotiations came out around the same time 6 hostages, including some of those who would have been returned had the deal gone through, were killed, and people correctly blamed Netanyahu. But I think this also makes it very clear that it's hard to find unbiased reporting, so we got to go back to basics. What do we want? Well, I think it's fair to say most want to stop the fighting. I say most because both Hamas leadership and Netanyahu are likely to either be removed from office or at least have diminished power if the conflict ends. So from a purely self-interested perspective, neither was likely to agree to a deal, and a deal requires both to agree. So this was always going to be hard. In the short term, an end to the fighting means a ceasefire and a hostage return. But the CIA leaked out a report stating that Netanyahu cannot agree to any ceasefire deal or his government would fracture and collapse. And I agree with that assessment. Hamas has agreed to a few deals now, which is a big step forward, but there are still some concerns there too. In the long term, an end to the fighting means a Palestinian state, so we don't return to the conditions that created October 7th. Netanyahu and his government have basically made careers out of preventing a Palestinian state, so I doubt this can ever happen while they remain in charge. But to give some good news, Biden did succeed in getting both several Arab and several Western countries to agree to provide security for a new Palestinian state, so both Israelis and Palestinians can be safe. Also, they agreed to provide money to rebuild Palestine, so we have most of the external requirements for a two-state solution. So what is America's role in this? Well, first, we give Israel an absurd amount of money and weapons, especially if you consider that Egypt, the second most given, was given to them partly to get them to stop fighting Israel. Not only do we give absurd amounts of money and weapons to Israel, but we give them the latest tech, including their very own variant of the F-35. This also makes us vulnerable to tech theft if our alliance ever breaks down. We have given them all this aid for a number of reasons over the years, but the current reason that gets cited is as a deterrent to prevent a wider war with Iran. I believe Netanyahu has been taking advantage of this by escalating conflicts every time he's concerned aid may be cut, thereby forcing us to provide more aid to prevent a war. The left has long pushed to reduce or end this military aid, and I agree in the long run, these problems will persist if we continue arming them to this degree. But there are some short-term concerns I think we need to consider. Israel has so many weapons already that even if we cut off their supply now, they could keep fighting for a long time. And if they do, then we would no longer have the same say in how they use those weapons. So while I know many on the left like to say just cutting off the weapons would instantly solve everything, it's not necessarily that simple. Here's a clip of a member of Netanyahu's coalition. You see both how much they freaked out after a single weapon shipment was stopped, as well as how ready they were to demand Israel just ramp up the war crimes. The US is threatening not to give us precise missiles. Oh yeah? Well, I got news for the US. We have imprecise missiles, and we have the right to defend ourselves. So maybe instead of using a precise missile and taking down a specific room or a specific building, I'll use my imprecise missiles and I'll just collapse 10 buildings. 10 buildings. 10 buildings, that's what I'll do. I should note, Israel has already been using a very concerning amount of dumb bombs. And while I point out that just stopping the weapons wouldn't necessarily stop everything, those weapons do give the US a great deal of leverage, which we can and should be using to push Israel towards a ceasefire. But there's a number of challenges, so let's list those. 1. We already have conditions on our aid, which Biden has not done nearly enough to enforce. The Leahy Law prohibits U.S. security assistance to countries that block U.S. humanitarian assistance or violate human rights, both of which there is substantial evidence of. How do we enforce new conditions on aid when we haven't been enforcing the existing conditions? 2, and this may explain why Biden hasn't done more, Netanyahu could escalate conflicts, most likely with Iran and their proxies such as Hezbollah. You see, Biden is far more concerned about the conflict growing than anything else. So this is how Netanyahu has leverage over us. If these latest pager and walkie-talkie attacks actually do lead to a full-blown war, things could change rapidly. Biden may finally stand up to Netanyahu. He has refused to join Israel in striking Iran earlier, and he should understand that joining a war would be political suicide. But while a larger war may lead to a clearer path, it would come at the highest of costs in lives. 3. Depending how much is conditioned, there would be a bipartisan effort to impeach the U.S. president, especially after the losses of Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman. Those losses not only take away 2 votes for doing more to support Palestinians, but they also signal that this is a losing political issue, and we will hear very little from Democrats between now and the election on Gaza. Elections have consequences, and AIPAC won. 4. If conditions don't work, and they rally around Netanyahu, they would no longer have to go through the motions to pretend they are meeting our demands, and things could get much worse. 5. There are worse people than Netanyahu in Israel's government. If his government collapses, we need to be very careful so we don't empower those even worse than him. 6. Geopolitics. If we stop sending weapons, it would endanger our alliance. And while I question the value of that alliance, thanks to our leaders, they have access to most of our latest tech. And I can think of a few countries that might be willing to step in to provide weapons in exchange for access to that tech. Also, there's a ton of allies who expect that if they are attacked, we will sell them weapons. So there was some concern prior to basically all of those countries asking Israel to stop, that we needed to show that we stand by our allies. 7. This only pressures Israel, not Hamas. But Hamas has agreed, so why am I still concerned about this? Netanyahu claims Hamas is bluffing, and while I don't trust him in the slightest, there is reason to believe this is possible. As I said before, from a purely self-interested perspective, it is surprising that Hamas would agree to a ceasefire, unless they were sure that Netanyahu would never agree, which has become pretty obvious. If you are sure the other side won't agree, and you can gain more support by agreeing, you may as well agree for all the upsides, knowing that you won't have to deal with the personal downsides that could come from the conflict ending. So what do we do with that? Well, normally, if you think the other side in a negotiation is bluffing, you call the bluff. But Netanyahu won't do that, because he is either afraid they aren't bluffing, or he is afraid his coalition can't even tolerate that. Either way, I think it's clear Netanyahu will never agree to peace and has to go. But that still leaves the US with a problem because we don't have leverage over Hamas to pressure them like we do over Israel. I will note this situation would be different had Trump not taken us out of the Iran nuclear deal, since Iran is the main country arming Hamas. How does this end? At this point, the barrier is Israel, specifically Netanyahu and his government. I do not believe Netanyahu will agree to any deal, especially before the US election, where he is no doubt hoping for a return of Trump, who instead of asking Israel to stop like Biden, says Israel should just go faster, and has called Biden and others Palestinians as an insult. Now, this may sound hopeless to some, but this just directs our actions. Since I do not believe Netanyahu will agree to a ceasefire, the solution is to ask, how do we go after his support and try to break up his coalition? His coalition relies on many parties and a 4-seat majority. Most of those parties have more than 4 seats, and so if any of them leave, his majority would be gone. The problem is they're basically all to the right of him. And the main things they seem to agree on is continuing the conflict with Hamas and dismantling their judiciary. So how do we go after Netanyahu's coalition? Conditions on aid. While I've laid out the downsides, this is certainly a powerful option that can apply a lot of pressure. Israeli protests and work stoppages. I know there are those who don't want to support these protests and strikes because they didn't protest to this degree about the 40,000 dead Palestinians. But Israeli protests are far more of a threat to Israeli politicians than foreign protests. That said, I see a lot more hope for work stoppages than protests. The Israeli government was already facing heavy protests from attempting to dismantle their democracy, so I don't think protests will be enough. Targeted boycotts. I do want to emphasize targeted, though, as we have had a lot of very poorly targeted boycotts that haven't actually cost the politicians. I would suggest actually finding out the monetary interests of politicians you want to pressure. Other diplomatic pressure. At this point, there's not much more to be done here. Finding another random leader to ask Netanyahu to stop won't do much. But continuing the pressure we already have may eventually have a chance to help. Politics. These are politicians. There are always deals to be made, dirt to be found, donors to be pushed. It is entirely possible that the way this ends is by getting Netanyahu's coalition to split up on a completely unrelated issue, which does present a few other options, such as the conditions on aid doesn't have to directly condition on agreeing to a ceasefire. Perhaps another condition could still break up their coalition while avoiding some of the downsides. Finally, foreign protests and organizing. To the extent they can push for any of the above, can help to achieve a ceasefire. Thanks for hearing me out. I know this is a controversial topic and there's obviously a ton more to be said, but I wanted to focus on solutions and try to keep the video short. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I have a link to my Patreon in the description if you want to further support me.